Okay, Year 10, so we are going to pick up today where we left off on page 54, and what we have read so far in Stave 4, Scrooge overheard some chaps on the street in the trading quarter talking about a man who died and how there was going to be no one at his funeral, and laughing about that. He then kind of a couple of instances later went into the Victorian slums, the dwelling of a rag and bone man, and heard some people laughing about stealing from a dead man's apartment and selling on his bed sheets, his curtains, his clothes and other finery. So that's where we got to. The spirit has just shown Scrooge a dead body laying on a bed, but Scrooge is too fearful to look at who it is. So we are here to the bottom of page 54, and we're going to go straight into our reading. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of children at their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed to answer. "Is it good," she said, "or bad?" to help him. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents," she said, amazed. "There is. Nothing is past hope. If such a miracle had happened—" "He's past relenting," said her husband. "He's dead." So someone who has power over them, who they want to relent, so let them off for something, has died. She was a mild and patient creature if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of the heart. "What the half-drunken woman who I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to be quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." So, the person who's died lent them money, and they're happy that he's dead because they think that whoever takes on the debt will be less cruel than him, essentially. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could now show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. "Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," said Scrooge, "or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me." The ghost conducted him through several streets, familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling they had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing. But surely they were very quiet. "And he took a child and set him in the midst of them." Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out. As he and the spirit crossed the threshold, why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time." past it rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book, but I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother. They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her word, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there is your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it the most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved. So you can probably all guess what's happened from what's been said. There is no Tiny Tim. Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert? Said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. He broke down all at once. Let's pause that. Okay, so we've got this repetition, emphasising his youth. Obviously, we link that to high infant mortality rates. So here Dickens is sort of creating or garnering empathy from the reader who would have known someone who'd lost a child. So really emphasises his youth and his vulnerability. So let's just zoom on the word little. Vulnerability. Okay. So pause to get that copied down. Right. Carrying on. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart perhaps than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down on it, and when he thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how we ever knew that, I don't know. Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everybody knows that, said Peter. Well, very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service for you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now, it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he'd known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit. You would be sure of it, my dear, returned Bob, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Only hear that, Peter, said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob, "one of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there was among us?" "Never, father," cried they all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said little Bob. "I am very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him. His daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. "Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at end. I know it, but I do not know how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead." The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these later visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of business men, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. "This court," said Scrooge, "through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the ass. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come." The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. "The ass is yonder," Scrooge exclaimed. "Why do you point away?" The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. So Scrooge is thinking that this place seems fitting for the man he's heard so much about, who's so cruel to others who no one really liked. So this weedy, overgrown graveyard with no kind of pleasant rural scene, just surrounded by houses, seems appropriate for this mean man. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are the shadows of things that may be only?" So this is a flashcard quote. So we've got an interrogative sentence. Now we've got will and we've got may. And these are modal verbs. So Scrooge wants to know whether these things are certain or whether they're possible. Yeah? So the interrogative sentence shows that he cares. So he cares about changing the future. And that's because maybe it creates a curious tone. Maybe helpless tone. So he's asking the spirit for guidance, for answers. Still the ghost pointed down to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me." The spirit was immovable as ever. See, I told you, every time the spirit responds, it's in a simple sentence. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" he cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. "No, spirit! Oh, no, no!" The finger was still there. "Spirit!" he cried, tight clutching at his robe. "Hear me! I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been before this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope?" So we're just going to highlight this. I'm not the man I was. Well, that's a metaphor, isn't it? Because it's not technically true. He is still the man he was, physically. What he's trying to show is that he's changed his personality. So it emphasises total personality change. Okay. For the first time the hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down on the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you've shown me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. Okay, so at the start we asked whether the hand was judgment or guidance. Kind suggests it's guidance. Okay, kind. But then trembled. So the future is weakening. So what has been laid out in the future as coming true is now weakening through Scrooge's response. "I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all of the year. I will live in the past, the present and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in its entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw a alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Okay, that's Stave 4 done. So, your next task is to complete your flashcard. Okay, so year 10, let's do a quick flashcard. So we're going to do the quote, "My little child." Okay, the rest of the quotes you'll be doing yourself, but let's do "my little child" myself. So where? It's in Stave 4, isn't it? And the physical where is the Cratchit house. Who says it? Bob Cratchit. And more specifically, it's about Tim. Tiny Tim. You want to give him his full name? What? He is mourning his death when in the future. And why? So to show the extent of his grief, but it's not just of Bob, it's of the poor, all these people who do not have the right lifestyles to keep their children alive, to be able to nourish them, to pay for doctors and medicines. Okay, so pause the video now and make sure you've got that out. Okay, so we're going to go for a technique, a zoom, and then we're going to think about sort of the writer's purpose here. So let's go with the zoom first. Little. It emphasises Tim's youth and vulnerability. So the fact that he was so young when he died. Okay, so when we get onto the writer's message, we'll be looking at Dickens and that kind of injustice of the death of young children. Okay, so we've got repetition. Draws attention to this, and by this I mean his youth and his vulnerability. And then we have the kind of writer's message. I'm going to do WM, injustice or the sadness of high infant mortality. Dickens wanted more done to support the weak. Okay. Right, so make sure you've got that copied out. Make sure you do the rest of your flashcards. I think one of the ones from today we did last lesson, so there's one fewer for you to do. Okay, off you go.